Good morning and welcome to our 17th Annual African Investigative Journalism Conference. I'm Anton Harber in Johannesburg, convener of the conference. It's really good to see you in real life and virtually. We're all adjusting to this new hybrid world of conferencing and learning how to do it. And in doing that, this year we've taken some bold steps forward in how we're doing the conference. We're running out of 5 cities simultaneously. And let me welcome them. Nairobi. I'm hoping that we would see Nairobi. No? Okay. Abuja. Dakar, oh dear, Addis, and of course us here at Wits University, at the Wits Club at Wits University in Johannesburg. With gatherings in 5 cities, as well as live streaming all of the program, I think we can say this is our most Pan-African conference yet. We're proud of it. And I must first start by thanking our partners in each of these cities. In Nairobi and Dakar, it is Code for Africa. In Abuja, it is Premium Times. In Addis, it is Fojo International Media Support. In Joburg, we're based at Wits Journalism, as I said, the journalism department at the University of the Witwatersrand. Well, we have ahead of us 5 days packed with masterclasses, panel discussions on critical issues that we face as investigative journalists, training, cutting-edge techniques, forensic and other techniques, and much more. Let me talk about some of the highlights that I hope you are able to take part in over the next few days. Immediately after this, we kick off with what's a running story, a big running story, a big global running story, the Pandora Papers, where we talk to some of those who've been working on the story in this continent. Later today, we have 2 of our great American friends in conversation, Nicola Hannah-Jones and Ron Nixon. Tomorrow evening, we focus on the situation in Eritrea during the Carlos Cardoso Memorial Lecture, an important annual event at our conference, where we show solidarity for journalists who are facing persecution for their work. We have masterclasses from an array of the best, both locally, continentally, and internationally, Bellingcat, Amambugani, and others. We bring you local perspectives, continental perspectives, global perspectives. But most of all, running through all of this, we'll be showcasing how much interesting work is being done across Africa. That's just some of the elements and highlights. Please take a close look at the program, and you'll see there really is a lot to choose from. And a great thing also is that it's all being recorded. Will be up on our website. So if you miss anything, you can watch it online. We'll be uploading and sharing the links for every session within a few hours of each session. Please note also that we are translating to and from French in all of the plenary sessions on the WOVA app, and I assume you've all downloaded the WOVA app because it really is an essential tool for this conference. You get a choice on each plenary session between the French and the English, and just choose which language you want to listen to, and that's what you'll get with live interpreting. Please note also that you can use the WOVA app to communicate with and among all the conference delegates. You can create your own meetups. You can ask questions, make comments and suggestions, and just give general feedback. You can talk to other individual attendees, or you can talk in groups. really is a useful app, so please make full use of it. Every session has a question and answer part to it. You can ask your questions in Wova. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can ask in the chat there. We do have people monitoring the questions there, and they will be fed to the facilitator, the panel, or the speaker in order to answer them. We also have our resident artist, Roy Blumenthal. Well, he calls himself a digital sketchnoter. Can we see him, please? There we are. There's Roy. During plenary sessions, he'll be drawing live notes that will help us follow the content, as you can see, along with his caricatures of people like me. He's quite cruel in his caricatures, so please don't take it to heart. You'll sometimes see him full screen, as you just saw him, sometimes in a corner of the screen. Sometimes you'll just see his work, or you'll see him live as he's working from his studio. All of this material will be made available afterwards on our website. But the most important thing is you will see how much interesting and important journalism is being done across Africa. How effectively our journalists in many countries are holding power to account, exposing wrongdoing, tackling tough issues. During these 5 days, we hope to encourage more collaboration across borders, across the continent, within countries. We're all finding that journalism these days requires and thrives collaboratively, and it's a theme we pick up repeatedly in the conference, and we hope that we provide a platform here for you to meet, network, and build collaborative relationships with your peers across the continent. Particularly, I think, in those countries where journalists are given the hardest time, where it's most difficult for journalists to do their work. I mean, we know there are countries that are fairly open and where investigative journalism is practiced with reasonable ease and effectiveness. We know there are other countries where it's extremely difficult, and a few countries where it's almost impossible. What is striking is how in all of these places we see people with dedication and courage doing what they can, how they can, to hold power to account, to get the stories out, to tell what's happening in their countries, and to play the critical role that journalists have and must play in our continent. Well, thank you. We're going to move now into the first session, Pandora Papers. So let's go to that. Thank you very much. We'll carry on straight into Pandora Papers. We have 3 speakers, and we hope that they're all joining us online now. There we are. Hello, good friends. If I'm correct, one of you is in Nairobi, John-Allan Namu, well-known Kenyan journalist, an old friend of this conference who's spoken here before, and who has been working on the story from Nairobi. My former student, Latashia Naidoo, working now for Carte, Blanche in Johannesburg, and has been working on the papers from a South African perspective. Welcome, Latashia. And Will Fitzgibbon, also an old friend of this conference, been attending it in real and virtual form for many years. Welcome, Will. Are you in Washington? Where are you?
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia.
I hope you heard where that was. I didn't.
Okay.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Will, perhaps I could start with you, because you're involved, in a sense, at headquarters, coordinating the story globally, aren't you? So if you could tell us a bit about how the story comes about, and the role you've been playing in it.
Sure, happy to.
Oh no, well, we've lost your sound. There we are.
How's that? Can you
That's
hear
good.
me any better now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation, Anton. As you mentioned, the Pandora Papers investigation is actually still going on as we speak. There are journalists in Zimbabwe, Madagascar, Senegal, and Niger who today and in the coming days are still publishing their investigations. But let's take a step back. The Pandora Papers investigation is, to my knowledge, and unless I've corrected, the largest investigation, first of all, of any journalists around the world, but also particularly the largest investigation of African investigative journalists in particular. And that's a result of both the leaked documents that form the basis of the project, and also the experience that many of us as reporters on the Pandora Papers have had with similar investigations in the past. Many of you will know ICIJ from previous investigations like the Panama Papers or West Africa leaks. And I think it's important to remember with collaborations of this scale that it doesn't happen overnight. John-Allan and I have known each other for a few years now, although this was our first successful time collaborating together. Latashia and I met quite literally through Anton Harber many, many months ago now. And I say that because trust and professional and personal relationships are a part of successful collaborations of this kind. The Pandora Papers was an incredibly complex and sensitive investigation, as you can imagine. We're talking about 12 million leaked confidential documents relating to secret financial activities of some of the world's most powerful people and of some of the world's richest people. And what that means as a result is that the stories that were being told from an African perspective and a global perspective were complicated and needed time to be achieved. We had never seen before the number of African politicians and their secret financial deals as we had with the Pandora Papers. We're talking at least 3 current heads of state, from Kenya to Gabon to the Republic of Congo, to a princess in Morocco, and of course ministers all across the continent, from the Prime Minister of Ivory Coast to the Minister of Security and Information, Jim Mwezi in Uganda, and kind of everything in between, from ambassadors to children of ministers to honorary consuls, as well as, of course, as many as you would know, power players who, while they don't have any official political titles, are incredibly powerful politically nonetheless. And I think everyone in listening to this conference will know that sometimes it's the people without official titles that in many countries actually hold more political sway than those that do. So what was my role and why am I talking here? I work at ICIJ as a reporter, so I wrote many Pandora Papers stories, including helping John-Allan and his team with their story about the Kenyatta family. But one of my jobs and one of my joys in life also really is coordinating the African partnerships on a project like the Pandora Papers. And that really means spending not just the project, but months and years before we even launch a project, identifying reporters who ICIJ can work with on upcoming projects. And that kind of collaborative spirit is core to what ICIJ does during projects and outside projects, in order to identify reporters who have the skills to enable a project like this to succeed. And when I talk about skills, I don't necessarily just mean who's the best reporter. And if I've said this once at the AIJC, I'll say it 1,000 times again. Often, the best journalists on paper make the worst journalists to collaborate with. And I don't mean that in any kind of negative way. Every journalist has the right and the ability to practice their journalism as they see fit. My experience and many months and years of tears and sweat has taught me, however, that when you're working on a project for 1 year or 6 months, and when you're dealing with incredibly sensitive information that if it got into the wrong hands and if it was leaked early, for example, could be incredibly damaging to the entire project. When you're talking about these projects, you want to work with people who you can count on, rely on, and who understand collaboration to their very core. And I'm very pleased that so many, well, all of the reporters who we worked with on the Pandora Papers from across Africa understood that, and really, I think, are part of this ever-growing family of collaborative journalists who understand the value of why a South African or a Kenyan or a Burkina Faso reporter should really, as much as possible, work with reporters from the UK and France and Russia, because time and time again we see how those kinds of stories are strengthened 100-fold as a result of such collaborations. I'm going to stop there as a brief introduction and pass back to you, Anton.
I'm sorry if the sound was a bit difficult for the first minute or two, but I think it has improved and it's a lot clearer now. So thank you. John-Allan, could I come to you to ask you to say some introductory remarks about how you came into this project, how you've worked on this project, and what amazing stories we're going to be seeing.
All right, thanks a lot, Anton, and hello to everybody in South Africa. Hello to Will and Latashia. So, about, I want to say about 10 months ago, Will got in touch and told us about this leak and who it included. And there's Nick Matthias and Ted Jury and Purity Mokami, who used to work with us and now is a data fellow at Finance Uncovered. We really spent majority of our time focusing on the story that then came out on October the 3rd, which was about the Kenyatta family's secret companies. But I will say also that there are a number of other very, very interesting characters within the leak that we want to report about in subsequent days and weeks, who have very interesting overlaps with that family, as well as with a lot of Kenya's political elite. We spent quite a bit of time trying to understand the nature of the companies that they had set up, chiefly in Panama and in the British Virgin Islands. So we looked at about 13 companies belonging to the immediate Kenyatta family. And by immediate, I mean President Uhuru Kenyatta's, brother, sisters, and mother. And then there's also a family member, a brother. The brother-in-law to Uhuru Kenyatta, whose companies have also been cited as being part of the leak. And the thing that we spent the most time trying to understand, at least I did, was what the differences were between trusts and foundations, and in some cases, shell companies and shelf companies that were set up by various members of this family, and trying to understand how it was that they did so, who the interlocutors were, the enablers, I think is a term that's being used, who the enablers were that then helped them set up, why they chose a specific route. And we found really interesting, again, overlaps between the kind of service providers, enablers that they used, and the ones that were being used by other political elite in Kenya. For instance, we found that the private wealth arm of a Swiss bank was also used by the former president of Kenya, Daniel Arap Moi, who passed away in 2019, but was used by him, I think, in the late 90s, as well as General Sani Abacha from Nigeria, to funnel money, essentially, at least in their case, which seemed to have been corruptly gained, into offshore locations around the world. What I think was also interesting was just the extent and how long the Kenyatta family has had some of those companies. Now, if you check the company registry in the British Virgin Islands, some of those companies have been struck off for non-payment of annual dues and that sort of thing, but some are still active. And essentially what we looked at was a period of over 20 years that they had been investing and opening companies and wrapping them in other companies and using enablers to try and throw anybody who might be interested, throw the scent off a little bit for anybody who might be interested in figuring out who the ultimate beneficial owners were of those companies. And ultimately what we came up with is a story that asked that question. So just for the audience in South Africa and everybody who's watching, the Kenyattas are amongst the richest, if not the richest political family in Kenya. President Uhuru Kenyatta himself had been mentioned, had been reported on by Forbes Africa as being among the richest people in Africa. At the time, I think Isabel dos Santos was one of the richest, and we all know the story with her. But he had been reported as being one of the richest people in Africa. So it is a family that has incredibly deep roots in Kenya's economy, going back to right after independence. They have private banks, they're invested in tourism, they're invested in agriculture. They have the biggest milk company in Kenya, which also has been bought by certain other foreign interests. They really have their hands in every part of Kenya's economy. And the question we're asking was that, if you have such deep roots in our local economy, why invest in secrecy jurisdictions? And not just invest, but invest in such a way that it is very difficult to establish that you actually are doing so, right? So if you were to look through any of the companies that the Kenyattas had opened, you wouldn't find their names on them. You'd find nominee directors from one of these enabler companies. And it seemed very, very strange. I think ultimately the question that is being asked of President Kenyatta himself is, what does this make of the kind of investment you want other people to make in Kenya if your family is then investing offshore, right? That's the fundamental question. So yeah, that's really what we spent a lot of time doing. Like I said, there are other people who are very, very interesting. I won't mention who at this point in time, but will be forming part of our reporting in subsequent days and weeks from the Pandora Papers leak. But it was a real pleasure working with Finance Uncovered, who have huge amounts of experience working on this. I learned quite a bit from them, of course, from Will, and from the collaborative energy that came from all across the world, and seeing what kinds of things people were finding. Yeah, I'll stop there for now, Anton.
But Latashia, won't you tell us about your experience in the story, how you got brought in and what you've been doing, and maybe some hint of what we can expect?
Hi, Professor. Hi to everyone here. Hi, John. I think it's prudent to mention, Professor Harber, that you actually facilitated the introduction between myself and the ICIJ. And after, I think, the very first conversation with Will, we knew that this was a good fit. This is the first time, I think, since the Panama Papers that there's been a television or broadcast element to coverage of a global data leak by a South African outfit. And I was very excited to get on board. A little overly ambitious in the beginning, because this was the first time I'd ever worked on a document leak, something of this magnitude. And I expected to just punch in names of high-profile politicians and business people and find the dirt on them immediately, which was not the case. It's been months and months and months of very much a solo effort in terms of my investigations from a South African perspective, trying to find links, trying to find connections. And it's also been a re-education for me as a journalist, given that my background is not business or finance. So having to learn about offshore systems and this sprawling secretive industry that exists, and tax havens, and like John-Allan mentioned, the difference between shell and shelf companies, that was something that took a while for me to get my head around. But I think it was very important within the context of these investigations to have that fundamental understanding of what this document leak entailed, so that I would be able to dig deeper and dig further to actually find something that implicated high-profile people within the system of illicit financial flows, etc. It's been an interesting few weeks in the run-up to breaking the story. Blanche did an initial teaser on the 3rd of October, but this Sunday, on the 17th of October, we'll be breaking our first story implicating well-known, very high-profile businessmen or business people who have been implicated within the Pandora Papers. It's been interesting in the sense as well, I had this conversation with Will on Saturday, that after basically not being on the radar at all, my devices got hacked this weekend. So I'm subsequently having this conversation with this panel on an old device while my MacBook and my primary iPhone are being swept for malicious spyware or bugging devices. So the reality of the situation is that high-profile people know that they are going to be exposed. And from what I'm seeing, there has been some pushback. I think the deniability from the people we've approached and asked for comment with regard to the evidence we found within the papers is going to be the biggest hurdle in terms of just translating this information to a viewership. But these are stories that need to be told. These are stories which are going to have resonance within South Africa, within the continent, and globally as well. And the most difficult part for me was embarking on this basically blind and as an individual, as opposed to working, like John-Allan said, with having that collaborative effort with other news outfits and organizations. And I think that moving forward, if another document leak of this magnitude does emerge, it would be great to see more collaboration within South African news agencies, as opposed to there being journalists who are so territorial almost of stories that need to be told collaboratively within a South African context. But I'm very excited to be working on this project. It's been months of lots of sleepless nights trying to understand the spreadsheets, trying to go through all the documents. But Will and the ICIJ team have been fantastic in terms of hand-holding, in terms of guidance, in terms of just being there to listen if you have an idea or you need a new approach in terms of how to investigate a story or a story angle. So I'm very excited to be a part of this, and I'm excited to be telling the South African stories moving forward.
Please, everyone out there, put questions into Wova, put questions into the Zoom chat, or if you're in one of the venues, please indicate you have a question. We'll call you to the mic to put your question. So please indicate to us if you have a question. If you're in cities other than Johannesburg, indicate to your hosts there, and they are communicating with me, and we will switch to you to take your questions. We'll try and keep it running as smoothly and quickly as you can. Will, let me come back to you with a question that's straightforward, but if you can answer it. How did you authenticate these documents?
I can't speak to how ICIJ got the documents, but the authentication part of it is actually rather easy, somewhat surprisingly, I suppose. You know, the bigger a data leak is, in some ways, the more confident and reassured I become by the accuracy of the documents. Because if you have 600 journalists looking at 12 million files, you have a very good ability to be able to weed out what seems truthful and what doesn't. Because you've got 600 journalists who take elements of those leak files and we start comparing them to public records. So, for example, we'll see the birth date of the Zimbabwean presidential advisor for economic affairs, and we can match that to public records. Or we'll see the birth date of Kenyatta Uhuru in the documents, and that will match also public records. Court documents are incredibly useful. I know that Latashia's story and a number of other stories have also have been related to court matters in countries around the world, for example. So that allows us also to confirm, at least in part, some of the documents of what we see. The authenticity of the documentation is never what keeps me up at night. There are plenty of things that do, but it's not the authenticity of the documents. And let's also remember, every reporter, John-Allan, Latashia and others, we spend, in many cases, more than a month seeking comment from the people who we're writing about. And that's incredibly important for this kind of high-stakes work because, if I got one fact wrong, if John-Allan got one fact wrong, if Latashia got one fact wrong, that potentially impacts and gives a reputational hit to the collective work of 600 journalists. So it's in everyone's interest to get their facts right. And that includes giving the subjects of our reporting 1 month or more to reply in some cases. Sometimes that means that your facts and your reporting does change. I always think of the right to reply process as an integral part of my reporting and not just a box-ticking exercise to cover my... I'm trying to find a way to say that politely. And not just a way to cover myself legally if things go wrong. Trust that answers the question. But Anton, I just wanted to make a really important point that I think Latashia and John-Allan brought out, which is being a successful investigative journalist and a successful collaborative investigative journalist doesn't mean you need to be the smartest cookie in the room, although both of these two people are. And it doesn't mean you need to know everything about everything. And that's what I think is so wonderful about these collaborations. A journalist from anywhere across Africa can ask another journalist anywhere in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America, or in Australia or ICIJ and say, what the heck does this mean? And part of the agreement in collaborating on a project of this scale is knowing that you'll have a colleague from somewhere in some country close by or far away who'll be able to help you out. And I think that's very important for all of us to remember because nothing is off limits in terms of collaborative journalism. And I hope everyone out there who's interested in telling impactful stories is aware of that and excited by that.
Very much. Well, you make a very important point about the right of reply being a fundamental part of the research for the story, not just a necessary exercise. Let me just ask you a follow-up question. Latashia referred to her hardware being hacked or having problems over the weekend. Has security been an issue? Dealing with hundreds of journalists in dozens of countries, it must be quite a complicated thing to do. Can you give us some sense of that?
Security is one of the things that keeps us up at night. Every journalist who works on the project needs access to an encrypted email system. Luckily, you can use encrypted email freely and fairly easily with Gmail accounts at the moment, for example. ICIJ does have a tech team that helps all the reporters on the project to the extent that we can. And then we, of course, monitor the database where the 12 million Pandora Papers records are kept constantly. Where the security issues become even more potentially vulnerable, I suppose, is that working with 600 journalists and working with 150 media outlets around the world means that there are potentially 600 computers to attack around the world. And there certainly have been attempts in the past week or 10 days. Journalists have had where reporters published stories or tried to publish stories that those websites were blocked, particularly high-profile stories like about the King of Jordan and his $100 million luxury property empire, for example. All of that is to say that security is incredibly present in every journalist's mind on this project. And I think, once again, you don't need to be a technological whiz to join these kind of projects. All you need to do is be sensible and communicative. Like Latashia says, as soon as you get the whiff of something going wrong, alert one of your team members, either in country or from ICIJ, because the difference between waiting 5 minutes and waiting 24 hours to alert someone could be the difference between, could be the difference between success and failure.
Thank you very much. John-Allan, you spoke a bit about the importance of the story. Let me ask about impact and potential impact, and I throw this open to any of the panelists, really. Well, let me start here. The previous examples of this sort, like Panama Papers, did they have the impact you expected? What impact did they have? What do you expect from the Pandora Papers? Is it just us learning more about an important topic, like how people are using offshore trusts, etc., and moving money around? Or would you expect to see other changes taking place as a result?
With the Panama Papers, I think there was a lot of impact globally, and in various jurisdictions, people. There were policy changes, there were changes in the law, and the tightening of how, especially offshore finance and that sort of thing works. With this specific story, let me just speak to what happened with us. Within days of our reporting, President Kenyatta himself came out with a statement saying that he is pleased with, essentially pleased with the leak, and that it enhances transparency and will shine a light on those dark corners of the world where secrecy is used to cover illicit financial flows, money laundering, and the like. He said he would issue a more comprehensive statement, which we're actually waiting for today. But it was very interesting that in his statement, as being one of, I think, a few leaders who actually responded to this, he didn't mention at all that he and his family had been the central part of our reporting, right? So that was very interesting. What it did do, though, at least in Kenya, was touch off a national discussion about offshore wealth, about what offshore accounts are, even though we reported on companies, not accounts per se, and what the implications are for leaders, holding offshore wealth. So we started to discuss the law, to discuss what it meant if a leader, if a public official, a state official had an offshore operated foreign bank account or had offshore interests. I think what that's done is that it's also informed the political discussion with a few months to a general election, which is important. I think that's one of the serendipitous things about the Pandora Papers, at least in Kenya's, from our point of view. It informed an already ongoing discussion, and I think it added quality and depth to political discussions that can often be very, very they can be very, very shallow when it comes to debates of this nature. And now I think what's happening is that the other media houses that are starting to take this on and take various elements of it and break down their reporting to deal with specific elements. So I spoke about offshore wealth. There will be, or there is already, an ongoing discussion about the law and why we don't have a law operationalized that deals specifically with this subject. On the political front, as I had mentioned, that there are now debates that are being sort of responding to the reporting from the Pandora Papers. Even though as the news cycle moves on, that kind of response becomes a bit more sedate, I think what it has done is that it has set a marker for the quality of the quality of debate in a society in response to investigative reporting. What we hope that it could do is that it actually does inform further policy changes in Kenya, legal changes that then ensure that especially our political elite, and our elite generally, just don't use these kinds of means to be able to hide their wealth. What it could do, I mean, I have dreams just like every other journalist about what the impact of our reporting is, but I think having been in this for a few years, you learn to be a little more restrained in what you hope for with your journalism, and kind of, as Will said in another discussion that we had, take your wins where you can and when you can. So that's kind of what we've been dealing with locally, Anton.
Thank you. Latashia, you spoke about this kind of story in this country being done for the first time for television, I think is what you said. Perhaps you could talk to us a bit about the challenges of doing it for television, and how you managed it in working with Carte Blanche, which, for those who don't know, is an Mnet program which runs here on Sunday nights and does all kinds of work and investigative work.
Thanks, Professor. I think that the biggest challenge for me with regard to how I've planned out to envision the story was to tell it as concisely as possible, given that there's so many elements of documents when it comes to this investigation. And we know that, unlike with a news story, visually translating hundreds of pages of court documents on television does not make for good TV viewing. So it's had to take some clever efforts almost in terms of creating animations, graphics. The ICIJ has been fantastic in terms of facilitating just those components to make the story visually stand out with graphics, logos, etc. But I essentially have 12 minutes to tell a story which has been months and months and months in the making, and has such a huge document element to it. So it's had to take some very creative editing in order to be able to create something that doesn't bore the audience for 12 minutes straight, doesn't confuse them with talk of offshore systems, tax havens, illicit financial flows, etc., but also implicates or holds to account the people who we need to expose and bring to the fore in terms of this form of corruption. So I've worked with varying elements of graphics, animation, just using audio recordings as well, to be able to tell the first story that's going to be broadcast this Sunday. And it's been difficult. We've tried to incorporate elements using drone footage of the area that we're going to be, that's of contestation for this next story. And the biggest challenge, I think, was the rights of replies, like we mentioned, how important it is for the story. None of the people that we approached for comment who are implicated in the papers agreed to an on-camera interview, or even an audio or telephonic interview, which made things very difficult in terms of trying to contextualize their role within this bigger picture of this investigation. And it's going to take a while before I think people are actually going to want to speak to us on camera with regard to the accountability aspect. But until that point, we've just got to be very clever in how we're choosing to tell this story, and how it articulates to a TV watching audience. I think with print media especially, you have the freedom to do so much more and tell so much more. But I'm limited to a 12-hour spot on a Sunday night for this first story. And I've been challenged to contextualize months of information into these 12 minutes, which I'm hoping will do its job once it's broadcast on Sunday. But going into this project, I never knew the difficulties, or never envisioned the difficulties it would actually entail to be able to tell an investigative journalism story, and to tell it well with all these visual elements. So this has been a huge learning curve for me, but hopefully once this gets out on Sunday, things are going to get easier along the way. The first story that we did broadcast on Sunday, the 3rd of October, though did have huge impact. I've been calling it the Pandora Papers pandemonium with regard to all the South African news outlets who are now jumping onto the bandwagon and wanting to tell Pandora Papers stories. So it's been interesting to see how they've been taking or interpreting what's come out thus far within their own reporting. And moving forward, I hope that I know we're throwing this word collaboration around a lot, but I hope that there will be collaboration so that we can actually invest all resources into telling a story across various mediums and not just in terms of broadcast with television. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Very much. I have a question from Betty Johnson Bayo in Liberia. She says, looking at the subjects involved, should we expect more publication of Pandora Papers in other countries? I'm not sure if she's talking about more coming from these papers, but I think we can also ask the question about whether, this is what, the 3rd or 4th such pile of papers in this way. Is this now an ongoing pattern? Should everyone who has an overseas account that's not fully declared be nervous? How do you see this playing out?
I can start by offering some thoughts on that. I would first of all say that there are definitely going to be more African stories from the Pandora Papers coming out, both with journalists who've already been working on this investigation for a number of months, and also more journalists, including many of you out there over the coming months. ICIJ will soon start doing what we always do, which is accepting requests by other journalists to access the underlying leaked data. That won't happen immediately, but that will happen in the mid to long-term future. And that's because each journalist brings their own set of eyes and their own experience to these 12 million documents. One of my favorite stories from the Pandora Papers is how a journalist in the Comoros, the first time that ICIJ had worked with a reporter in that small country, found literally two pages out of 12 million documents. And remember that when we talk about 12 million documents, some of these documents are thousands of pages long. So to find 2 pages with the name of the son of the president on it was quite a find. And from that, the reporter was able to produce an entire story that's now been on the front page of every newspaper in the Comoros for a week. And I think that's a great example of how these kind of files allow the right journalist at the right time to make very important discoveries. I think to pick up on points that John-Allan and Latashia have also mentioned is these files are not easy to understand. It's very rare that within 5 minutes you find a story that you'll be able to publish. Even when the name of your president is in there, as John-Allan, I think, can tell us, it's not a slam dunk. To go from seeing a name to understanding what the story is, and then to convincing yourself and your editors that there's a story of public interest here is a long process. And in many ways, that relies on sometimes 90 to 95% of information that reporters find outside the documents. Just because we're talking about leaked documents doesn't mean you don't have to do all the hard work that goes with journalism and that you've done in the rest of your career. In most strong stories from the Pandora Papers, more than half of the information that forms the basis of the story and the revelations comes from sources outside the leaked documents. Like we've said before, court records, interviews with sources, social media and OSINT kind of reporting. And that, I think, is very exciting because that means that lots of reporters out there will have knowledge that they can bring to these files and interpret them in other ways that even 600 reporters so far haven't been able to do.
Thank you very much. That's really very interesting. Before I come to our next question, any of the other panelists want to add anything to that? No? Okay. I'm going to move to take a question from Ray Joseph in Johannesburg.
My first one is just a comment and then a question. How well? So, right of reply, I've found is valuable in two ways. Is when people reply, you very often get context and information that you wouldn't have got. But from a legal point of view, when I do a right to reply, I will spend hours on it and cover all the aspects of what I'm going to report. So, in mitigation, you know, that someone can't come afterwards and say, well, you didn't ask us, we weren't aware of it. That's the right to reply. My question is more about preemptive strikes. And I've been the victim of quite a few in over the year or two, where you've put in questions and people then take your questions and turn it into a press release that spins the story. Lazy media who haven't been working on the story for months on end pick up and the story runs there. You know, that you can deal with. The other thing is the preemptive legal strike before you've even published. I've been working with a very brave editor who's just showed the finger, but it's a thing. How did you guys deal with it? Did it happen?
Hi, Ray.
Hi.
I think that with regard to my investigations, Carte Blanche has a very strong legal team behind it. So with regard to asking difficult questions and getting those right of replies, we do have legal viewings before a story actually goes out, so that the lawyers who are an external factor to the story, who have no context previously into what we're actually investigating just yet until they watch the first or the second edits, they're able to view my story from that legal perspective and offer their opinions as to, okay, this is what you can legally say. With regard to accountability, this is what can be said. Or essentially, you can't say this because we could be sued for libel or slander or whatever it could be. So I think in terms of that contextually, when it comes to the legalities of a story, we've got the backing of very strong legal minds who would be able to offer that legal perspective as opposed to a journalistic perspective, or a legal overview on the story. So I'm hoping moving forward that, like you spoke of lazy journalists who do take what's coded out of context. And we did have that with the initial story we broke on the 3rd of October, where things were being quoted completely out of context, which changed the entire nature of this entire investigation and what the Pandora Papers actually entail. I think moving forward, we have to protect ourselves legally as journalists. And you're a great example of that, Ray, with regard to some of the law, some of the court cases you've had to be part of or privy to. But we are prepared for an onslaught of whatever may come. And I think that's something that makes me sleep a little better at night, knowing that if there is something that emerges post our broadcast, I do have legal counsel and a legal team who will be able to back me up. And that's not something that's offered to all journalists within this country, unfortunately. But within the Carte Blanche scenario, I know that we're covered in that aspect.
Thank you. Do you want to add to that, John-Allan or Will?
Yeah, sure. So in our investigation, we had nothing from the Kenyattas, completely radio silent. I sent our right of responses, and Will followed up, and there was nothing until, as I had mentioned, after the story was published, then we got a response. But it is true, Ray, that we spent a huge amount of time just going through our rights of responses and trying to cover everything that we could. I think it's an important, part of any reporting, let alone investigative reporting, that you give the person who is a subject of your story an opportunity to respond. What we did see happen was there was quite a bit of spin around the story and dwelling on something that is factually true but contextually incorrect, or contextually misses the point, which was the fact that owning or operating offshore entities is not illegal, right? We say that all through up and down our story, but what then became a question that a lot of the people who would ordinarily spin on behalf of some of these political elites was that, well, if it's not illegal, then why spend all of this time on it? And that took quite a bit of telling and breaking down to people why the Pandora Papers are important. And it's not so much about the legality of the subject matter, rather the secrecy, the nature of the setting up of these entities. That was more important. And you could see that once more and more people got a hold of the story and watched the story, then that appreciation started to percolate a lot more. And those kinds of concerns died down. We have seen a few, digital attacks, and by digital attacks, I don't mean like malware, spyware, that sort of thing, but trolling and that sort of thing, targeted against us and anybody really who speaks about the story. But again, all of that seemed to have been dealt with by the fact that the story was so factually precise, and that like Latashia, that was the thing that made my pillow a little easier to sleep on, and has been for the past couple of weeks, that every single thing that we said can be backed up by a document which has been verified, which has been lawyered, which has gone through the process of gatekeeping and has now been presented to the public. That said, there could be things that because lawyers poke holes in the sky, there could be things that they would try and sort of finagle to ensure that there is some sort of credibility challenge on our story. But I think by and large we are prepared for that outcome, and we're ready to see what comes out of the president's response and what comes in coming days.
Let me just jump in there, Anton, and respond, if I can, to raise other point about preemptive strikes, because it is something that we've seen in the Pandora Papers, and I think it's a growing phenomenon. Rights to replies in some ways are a double-edged sword, aren't they? John-Allan and his team spent, sometimes it felt like almost as much time drafting their right to reply letter as they did drafting the script to their investigation. And what that means is, as soon as you share those questions with the subjects of your investigation, that person may choose to share your letter on Twitter or on Facebook. And if you've done a detailed right to reply, that will include all of the points that you intend to outline in your investigation. We saw that with the government of Panama in the Pandora Papers. The government of Panama, let's just say that some of them still harbor bad feelings from the Panama Papers, so they were worried this was going to be Panama Papers round 2. So once some of our reporters sent some questions to a powerful Panamanian law firm, those questions all of a sudden started appearing on social media. There were front page stories from Panamanian newspapers not involved in the project who claimed to have exposés about what ICIJ was up to. Look, would we prefer that didn't happen? Sure. But I think in this day and age, it's always likely to happen. And one of the big lessons I've learned from collaborations is that no matter what happens and no matter what information leaks out prior to an investigation being published, you need to stand firm, a little like Mel Gibson in Braveheart, when all of the soldiers are racing towards him. You need to stand firm and just believe in the quality of your reporting and be comfortable in the knowledge that, like John-Allan said, you had the context and you have the documents that back up what you're saying, and these kind of jealous competitors don't. And sometimes that's hard to swallow because it feels as though months of your life and months of your reporting is going down the drain in a way that you don't control. But my experience tells me in the long run that once your investigation is out, in terms of impact and in terms of reader engagement, people can tell the difference between a story that's actually been done professionally and a story that was on the front page that was a hit job that lasted a few seconds.
A move to a question from Nairobi.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. My name is Ronald Musoke. I report for the Independent magazine in Kampala. A quick one for Will. I'm trying to understand. I think the issue is about the process itself. I ask this because back home in Kampala, there were a few eyebrows raised when the subject published was some sort of, should I call him a smaller fish? They were expecting bigger principles, maybe on the level of the Kenyan principle. So they are wondering how do we come to get to Jim and not maybe the bigger person, if you understand what I mean. The process itself is a bit of a challenge for me to understand. How do you get to land on Jim and not any other person in Kampala? I think so. Jim Wes, yes, in Uganda. Well, I don't know whether my question is understandable, clear. Thanks.
Yes, I think I understand it. And really the answer is that these kind of leaked documents by their nature are always very imperfect and uneven. There were some countries like Lebanon or like Panama where literally there were 2, 3, 4, or 5 prime ministers, former prime ministers and presidents. In other countries, and Latashia can tell you that, the big political names didn't jump out. And it's heartbreaking, let me tell you. Every journalist who joins this project wants to have their president, their prime minister, and their family members appear in the documents, although John-Allan will also tell you that that doesn't necessarily make your life much easier. And to that, I would say a few things. One is, even though 12 million records sounds like a lot, it's a drop in the ocean in terms of how many documents exist out there about the offshore system. So just because in the Pandora Papers investigation, the highest profile Ugandan name was Jim Mwezi, the Minister of Security, doesn't mean that people with more political power than him are not using offshore structures. I look forward to the day when we as investigative journalists, led by reporters in Kampala, can reveal some more about the financial holdings of the president, for example. It would not surprise me at all if that were the case. But, unless 600 journalists or more who worked on this project are total fools, or unless there was some very impressive additional layers of secrecy added by close associates of more senior Ugandan politicians, I can confidently say that those names do not exist there. In their own right. That's one of the things I love about collaborating on this kind of scale. It means that no journalist can hide, even if for whatever reason John-Allan wanted to cover up the story about the Kenyatas. For example. The fact that there are 599 other reporters on the project looking at that same data means that that's impossible, right? Because someone else in Uganda, in South Africa, in America, in London, in France, they're going to see that name and then share with the others that finding as well. So it's very hard for any journalist or any country really to escape scrutiny. And that same rule applies to all of those crazy conspiracy theories out there about why we choose a certain date to publish, or whether or not the documents were given to ICIJ by the CIA, for example. There's just, with a collaboration of this scale, it's really quite difficult to pull the wool over everybody's eyes.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move to wrap this up. Thank you very much to our four speakers, our three speakers, and to all 600 journalists who clearly have done a remarkable piece of work, and to the ICIJ for this coordinating this extraordinary virtual newsroom spread across the world. It really is interesting and remarkable stuff. So thank you very much. What I'm going to try and do now is get a greeting from each of our host cities, what I tried to do earlier and the connections weren't ready, but I'm told they are ready. So could we get a big hello from Nairobi? Thank you. From Abuja. Hello, Abuja. Thank you. Let's go to Dakar. What do we have here? Is this Dakar? No. Well, hi, wherever. Hi. Hello. Addis. Hey, Addis, we're seeing empty chairs, but we know there's a bunch of you there. Oh dear. And of course to us here in Johannesburg. Thank you. We're dispersed around the world, but hopefully we're connecting and be able to talk to each other and network in some way. Is it possible to see what Roy, our artist, has made of this session? Thank you. Visual representation of what we're talking about. It will be on our website. It will be circulated. Thank you, Roy. And let me remind you that our next session is in 20 minutes. It's called Spooks and Surveillance. It's a conversation with Michaela Wrong, a journalist who wrote an important book that investigated the murder of the Rwandan head of intelligence or former head of intelligence in Pretoria a few years ago. An important story that says a lot about Rwanda and South Africa. And that's at 11:30 Central African or South African time. Please join us for that. You'll be in conversation with David Dembele. So thank you very much for this opening session. I look forward to seeing much more of you all live and virtually over the next 5 days. Thank you.